it kind of resonated with the idea of how a lot of emphasis is often placed on eaters, consumers, doing less harm with their food choices. A very kind of restricting kind of mindset. And it could be framed as, eating organic, avoiding certain foods, like perhaps meat or dairy, or, eating only imported health foods. There's lots of different ways that can be framed, different kinds of conversations. And these kind of prescriptions can sometimes clash or create divisions in terms of cultural practices or ancestral food ways, not to mention budgetary constraints sometimes come into play. And it can create a lot of personal and community conflict, trying to do less harm. And so, Phil, I was wondering, in terms of your work, how might an invitation to do more good? That was something that came up in our conversation last week. This idea of doing more good, could that help folks deepen our connection to land and place and culture through the food that we eat and share?
I I think so. I really like that phrase. I think moving into this new mindset of doing more good really is sort of at the heart of what I think is novel and perhaps radical about the way that people are now starting to use the word regeneration in respect to food and other kinds of design. Michael said something earlier that I think is related to this. He talked about photosynthesis as being inefficient, right? That there's, when we eat those plants, we get such a small fraction of the whole thing. And through the lens of doing more good, the way I think about that is that, well, that may be, but all of that's not for us. That's for the rest of the
Mm.
plant, or that's for other aspects of the world or the ecosystem, the living system around us, right? And so when you think about it only as for us, it's inefficient. But when you think about it as a generative network of relationships, maybe it's not anymore. And so this idea of doing more good sort of, I think, asks us
Mm.
to be in a posture where we say, there's a lot of going on around me that's not for me. What am I putting into this world that's not for me, but for the rest as well? And that's the generative change to the generative mindset, which is, if you put more in, there can be more collectively, in addition to more just for you. And so even just from the perspective, one way to think about this that I think is interesting is the concept of resilience, where being flexible, we talked about flexibility earlier, being flexible, allowing the cycles of release and renewal to happen at multiple timescales, from the soil to forest succession, working with those instead of trying to hold them constant and keep the landscape doing the same thing over and over and over again. That requires us to be flexible. It requires us to be resilient. And if we're relying on a particular crop from a particular part of the world, or a particular fishery, and there's some reason we can't, if we're flexible and willing, we can give our resilience back to that land and say, recover fishery, recover soil. We do the things that aren't for us, and so we give that resilience. And then in the time of crisis or directional change like climate change, what are those opportunities where we can give our resilience to the other parts of the world that need it, whether it's another family net down the street, or whether it's a piece of land that is and species on it that are aching to restore themselves and come back to life. That's what the first thing that comes to mind. But I do think that there's a really meaningful, and I don't want to overlook it, transition that we're seeing in the way people talk, with sustainability being this idea of doing less harm, as you said, and then the more we, and shrinking our footprint because our footprints are bad. Instead, starting to say, how can we grow our footprints in a way that's generative? So do more good for parts of the world that are not for us.